Ready to boost your video creations? Try Maxon Studio. Maxon Studio's got your back with a sleek dashboard that's like your own personal editing playground. We're talking dynamic capsules galore. Our capsules are designed to supercharge your content creation game inside After Effects. So say goodbye to staring at a blank screen wondering where to start. Maxon Studio hooks you up with pre-designed, customizable elements. The collection is always growing, from elegant motion graphics to seamless transitions, animated titles, and amazing effects. The best part is, you don't need to be a design wizard or spend hours tweaking every little detail, because user-friendly controls make it easy to tweak text, colors, and more to match your vibe. So, what are you waiting for? Start creating breathtaking videos today with Maxon Studio. Take it for a spin with our free 14-day trial. Level up your content now.
Hello everyone, how are we doing? Welcome back to the Maxon training team and the Maxon YouTube channels. My name's Ellie. I'm a trainer at Maxon and I'm joined once again by a very special guest. Hey Jess.
Hey, it's going great. Super excited for today.
Yes, me too. So just a quick one. We're actually during part 2 of this series, and this is where we're looking at Jess has been showing us some amazing kind of texturing workflows in some of the motion design stuff that she created for the September release. And so let me just open up my screen here. Here we go. So yeah, if you want to catch that first part where we looked at some distance shading, then you can actually find it on the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So let me just flick over to here. So this is our lovely Maxon Training Team YouTube channel where everything is timestamped thanks to Dr. Sassy. And if we scroll down, we can see, first of all, the upcoming live streams, including this one that we're currently doing. And we have a Create with Maxon playlist, and you can find that distance shading in motion first part of that series, which was a great one. So I'm excited for part 2.
Yeah, me too. It was so fun. I had a blast.
It was a great one. So let me really quickly go through some housekeeping, and let me just throw this link in the chat for everyone. So this is our lovely landing page that we have that has all the useful links that you might need access to. So first of all, the lovely events page, which is this one here. So you can see all the events that we have going on, whether they're in person or whether they're live streams that we have coming up. And so tomorrow, we actually have a What's New Creative Maxon for Red Giant and for ZBrush for iPad for the new release. So you don't want to miss those. And then we also have that Training Team YouTube channel. So the one that we just looked at, everything gets recorded, everything gets timestamped thanks to Dr. Sassy, and it gets uploaded on the Training Team YouTube. So you might be watching this on some of the other channels. For example, this goes onto the YouTube, the Maxon one, as well as the Maxon Training Team, but they only get uploaded onto the Maxon Training Team. So if you're trying to find something, make sure you're on that one. Also, as a thank you for those of you being part of our great community, watching our great live streams, we give away free t-shirts. All you have to do is click this link and type in the code, so it's a super secret password, which is beautiful textures. And let me just copy and paste that again. So that's in the chat for you. And then finally, if you want to learn something new, we have a great educational platform called Cineversity, and you can check out loads of different videos on here, loads of getting started series. So if you've never used like ZBrush for iPad, for example, and you want to learn it, then definitely head over to there. Cool. So, as I said, part 2 of this workshop where we've been diving into some great stuff. So what I'm going to do in just a sec, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jess. But just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, then there's actually a little chat box inside of YouTube. Feel free to ask us your questions, ask Jess anything you want on these projects, on, you know, her creative workflow. We had some really cool questions last week about kind of your creative process, which I think is kind of really interesting to learn about as much as kind of the actual workflow inside of the software. And then you've also put together some very cool project files. So one final thing in the chat for everybody, kind of spamming our own chat. I'm allowed to do that, right?
You're totally allowed.
So let me throw them in there. So yeah, all of the great stuff that we've been working on or that Jess has been working on throughout this series, you actually have access to. So yeah, feel free to download those.
Awesome.
So Jess.
All right. Should I dive right in?
Should we dive in? What are we going to be diving into today?
All right. So I'm going to show the renders like I did in the last stream that we'll be going into, and then we'll just dive into each one after I preview those. So this first one is this glass cloner, and we see that we just have this really fun ring of cubes, and they get turned into these like sphere cylinder shapes. And we've obviously got our beautiful caustics reflecting off of the ground. So I'm going to show you how to achieve this one. So to start, we're just going to create a classic cube. And this cube is going to be pretty big by default. I'm going to make this a little bit thinner on the Z axis, and then I'm going to scale this down by pressing T on my keyboard and dragging. And I want this to be pretty small. And then I'm going to, let me just drag this a little bit above our work plane. And I'm going to grab a cloner right away, and we can drag our cube right into that cloner. And then instead of grid mode, which it's set to by default, I actually want to set this to radial. And you can see we've actually got our clones in there correctly, but they are rotated a way that I don't want. So I'm actually going to go to the transform tab right away. And I believe it's the, actually it's not the P value, it is going to be this H value. So this is the one I want to rotate, and you could do whatever amount you desire. I'm just going to set this exactly to 90 degrees. And then I'm also going to increase the count of clones we have here. And I might play around with this radius as well. Maybe set this to 90 centimeters. So this is our starting clone. And then we need to transform these cubes into cylinder or spherical shapes. And you could probably do this a couple different ways. The way I ended up doing this for my scene is actually duplicating our cloner. So I'm going to hold Control and drag my cloner. And let's rename our first one to Cube Cloner. And I'm going to delete the cube from the copy we made. And I'm going to actually call this our sphere cloner. Or we could call it cylinder cloner. Whoops, I had a spelling error there. Make sure we get all the letters in there. And I'm going to now pull in a cylinder object. And this one I want to make relatively the same size as one of our cubes. So I'm going to scale this down so it's also fairly thin. And I want to put this also on the Z positive axis. And then I'm going to scale this cylinder down till I think it is about the same size as one of those cubes. So maybe this should be a little bit bigger. And now we can place this into that copy of the first cloner we made. And it should put those cylinders in the exact same position that our cubes are in. So if we zoom in here, you can see they're kind of intersecting with those cubes. So basically the effect here is that we need to transform the cubes into the spheres from this cloner. And the first thing I want to do here is actually grab a connect object, and we're going to put the sphere cloner in there. So maybe I'll call this like spherize, or just, we could just call this sphere cloner as well. And I'm actually going to hide this. So we should now just see the cubes. And I'm going to put our cube cloner inside of a null. So let's grab a null object and put the cloner in there. And we'll call this cubes. And the effect is done by actually using the shrink wrap deformer. So I'm going to go in here and grab a shrink wrap. And I want to pull this above my cube cloner, but within this null that has our cubes. So it should look in this order. And in this target object section, we can drag whatever object we want here. So thankfully we have our connect already set up. We can just drag this right in there. And you may see something funky happen with your cubes. And it doesn't matter what mode we make this, and you're like, okay, well, my cubes don't really look like spheres yet, and why is that? Well, if we hit N and B on our keyboard, we don't have any segments in our cube. So we need to just up those, and then we should start to see that change. So as I increase these, we're going to see we are now getting something closer to our cylinder shapes. So I'm going to hit NA on my keyboard again. I don't need to see that anymore. And I have a little bit of jaggedness in my cylinders. So I'm actually going to add a bevel onto the cylinder that's in the cloner as well. So that actually, I'm not seeing, maybe it's just hidden. Okay, I'm going to drag this onto my cylinder, and that should fix some of that jagged edges right away. So feel free to customize that or add that if you want, or don't. But the nice thing about using the shrink wrap object here is that we have the field section. So I can go in right here and I can just add a spherical field. And right now it's in the middle, so it's not really affecting any of those clones. But if I shrink this down a little, and I want to increase actually this inner radius, which is kind of controlling where the feathering of that field starts, I'm going to make that about this size. And then I'm going to drag this out so we're just above some of these clones. So you can see we're just affecting these two right now. I'm going to increase that a little bit, maybe take our feathering or inner radius in, something like that. And then I'm actually going to hide our spherical fields just so it's not in our viewport. So we can have a little bit less distraction going on in our scene. But okay, let's say also I might want to increase some of my clones because I think we could do with a little bit more. Maybe I'll just up this to 20. So make sure that if you want to add more clones or less, you're changing both the cube cloner and the one we made with the cylinders. And then you should still keep that consistency, and the cube should deform correctly. Okay, so we have the spherical field, but obviously we don't want to manually control this. We want to have this moving around on its own and morphing the target cubes. So the way I actually did that in my scene was I grabbed a sphere and I shrunk this way down. And this is going to act as kind of like a controller for where our field is at. So I'm going to drag this kind of in the middle of the clones that are being affected right now. And I'm going to drag this upwards, so it's hovering above them. And then what I can actually do is I can grab our spherical field in the layers and I can make that a child of our sphere. So now, let me also hide the spherical field. Now, no matter where I move my circle or my sphere, that field is going to move with it. So we've got our kind of controller for the effect set up here. So I'm going to actually just rename our sphere to field controller. And then I don't want to have to manually keyframe where that circle is as well. So I would like to grab a circle spline, and we can set this to the XZ axis. And then we can scale this down. This should actually match the radius of our cloner. So we know we set that to 90. So we can set that value right here to 90. And then I'm going to try to drag this so that it is centered with my circle. So it looks like the circle is kind of on that path around this circle spline. So now what we can do is if we click on our field controller sphere that we made, we can right click, go to animation tags, and there should be this align to spline option. So now we have a path where we can drag whatever spline we would like, and that circle will be able to follow that same path. So we can just drag our circle spline right in here, and it should kind of automatically snap the circle directly into the center of that spline. And then if we see we have this position slider, and now we can manually move where that sphere is at, and it will also move the field and likewise create the effect that we're going for. So I'm actually going to keyframe the position at 0 on frame 0. And then I'm going to go to the end and I'm going to set a keyframe for 100%. And then I'm just going to hide our circle spline from view. And if we just hit play and see what this is doing, we can see we have created that looping effect. The only other thing I'm going to do with these keyframes is I would like to make those linear, because I just prefer for this particular animation to have a linear animation. So I think my pop-up is showing in a weird spot, but I'm going to just choose linear for that. And let's see here. So now it should kind of loop a little bit more seamlessly. So that is kind of that effect. If you want to, if you're not a huge fan of just the harsh edges on the cube, we could also drag our bevel from the cylinder holding control and drag our own bevel layer onto those cubes just to give it a little bit more smoothness on those edges. But essentially, we've got the effect here. So I think we can kind of move on to creating the materials. So I'm going to close these for right now and open our materials panel. And let's create a standard material. And we'll call this clones, or we could even call it glass, but I'll just call it clones for now. And then I'm going to drag a copy, and I'm going to name this controller. And we could drag a ground plane in our scene as well, just so we have some surface for reflections to kind of show up on. Let me also see where our clones are hovering above, and I'm going to move this slightly upward. I don't want it to be touching the clones, but I just want a little bit closer. Okay, so now I think we can kind of set up our scene as far as materials and lighting. So I'm going to first grab a camera, make sure I'm in that camera, and then I'm going to set the focal length to 85 and then zoom out a little bit so I can frame this. And then maybe I'll move it here. Okay, let's pull our render view into the scene as well. And I'm going to dock this just to the right of my viewport and hit play so we can preview what we're working with. And we need an HDRI because this lighting is not ideal. So I'm going to come in here, and anytime I'm working with caustics, I kind of prefer having a dome light that's got a bright light source or something that will cast some intense shadows so that we can really see those caustics show up in the scene. So something like a really bright sunny dome light is going to be ideal here. So I'm going to grab this one, it's got a long name, but I'm dragging this one in. You could feel free to pick whatever you'd like. It might take a second to kind of load in the scene. And then we can get a feel for where our shadows are casting now that that has loaded. So already this would probably give us some interesting caustics. I might even try to emphasize the tilt even more by coming in here and changing this rotation value. So maybe about there. But let's now drag our materials onto our objects. So actually I don't want that. I want to go to our cube cloner, and we could put our clones material onto the cloner there. And then I'm going to grab my controller material and drag that onto our field controller. So I'll just start with the controller because it's pretty fast and easy. I made mine in the scene, I believe, like a bright red kind of metallic color. So I'm just going to change the base color there and up our metalness. And I didn't do this all the way, but pretty high value, about 0.7 or around there. And then I brought the roughness down a little. And I actually went in and added some red emission. So I brought this color also to a similar red and then brought the emission up to like 2. So I just liked that you could see that shine from the metallic value, but still get kind of an interesting bright object in the scene. So now we can move on to our actual glass material. So with our clones. So I'm going to double click on our cloner material here. Let me try resizing our window a little bit just so we can kind of see our scene, and I'll zoom in on our render view. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this okay. I know it's a little bit of a weird window here, but in my standard material, I want to take firstly the transmission weight all the way up. And immediately when I do that, you can see we now have glass in our scene. So we're off to a great start. I also want to take the roughness down, not completely to 0, but maybe around 0.05 or 0.06. I have heard that caustics, for whatever reason, work better when you have some slight roughness, not like totally 0. I'm not sure if that's just for brute force caustics or photon, but I just try to aim for around 0.05 for that value. And then I would like to color each of these clones uniquely just to get a little bit more of an interesting shade across everything here. So you guys probably saw this in the last stream. You know I like to use the color user data node. And I like to use ramps and color corrects. So I'm going to grab both of those nodes. So dragging a ramp and a color correct node. And the user data is what we can use to assign a random color value to each of our clones in our cloner. If we solo this, you're going to see it actually, oh, maybe it's not showing up here. Might be having an issue there. But if I plug, oh, it's because I have to, sorry. We have this preset option here, and you have to first select objects and then geometry ID color. And I think now if we solo this, yeah. So to kind of assign something random to all of your clones, you need to make sure you set the preset to objects, geometry ID color. And then we can use this and plug that into a ramp to say, here are the colors that we now want to assign to all of those random clones with their own unique IDs. So by default, we have our black and white ramp. So it's going to assign shades from black to white to our cloners. But I like to choose one of the existing presets that Maxon provides. I think the one I was experimenting with was Supersonic or this turquoise to orange. I just think these are fun. So you can see these colors look kind of bright and not exactly pastel, but they're not super dark, which looks great here. But I found that if we actually plug our ramp into something like the transmission color, they'll actually look pretty dark. So if we unsolo that ramp, you're going to see right away that they look a little bit more intense than they do just if you're previewing or soloing that node. So this is where I like to plug sometimes a ramp into the color correct. And I like to take the gamma up quite a bit, maybe up by 2. Oh, and I got to plug this. Make sure you plug it into the transmission color as well. But if you continue to increase the gamma and maybe lower that saturation a little bit, you're going to get some more pastel kind of tones, hopefully a little bit more accurate to what our ramp looked like when we soloed it. So these are a little bit more intense. And again, you can feel free to play around with that gamma value and the saturation until you're at a spot that you're happy with. But let's say that I like that for our clones. I am going to close this now. And one other thing maybe worth noting with having our bright material on our controller is that if you were to maybe increase the emission value and we had enough brightness in our scene, you could get some interesting bloom effects in your render. So if you click this cogwheel in the Redshift render view, we have all these post render effects, which are fun to play with. And here's bloom. So we probably won't see that in our scene right now, but if we had some more intense lights, you would really notice that. Okay, so we've made the glass, and maybe I'll increase our dome light intensity a little as well, but let me try 1.5. I just want that to be pretty bright. But now we got to talk about the actual caustics and some of those settings there. So right now, by default, if I go into my render settings and I hit Redshift and go to Advanced, this is where we'll be able to find where our caustics are and if they're enabled and the settings included in there. And by default, it's not on. So this is what our glass is going to look like. So actually, let me take a snapshot just so we can kind of compare these. So we have our snapshot here. Let me just make sure I hit play, and I might hide the snapshots for now. So let me go back to my render settings. If I now turn on the caustics and enable that, you're going to see that our shadows have become much richer. And I think in general, just the light is being scattered in a much more realistic way. You're also going to see we get all this fuzziness of the actual caustics that are bouncing across the floor. And by default, the Brute Force Caustics actually does a pretty great job of scattering all of these rays with just the default settings. So like 256 for the Brute Force rays that we see here. And then automatic sampling, I think, does a pretty good job. And maybe you just want to come in and turn on denoising so that it doesn't have so much fuzziness in your scene. But I've also found that certain caustic values can actually work really nicely. Like you could turn off automatic sampling. And I think in those cases, you might want to override these two sections here on reflection and refraction. So you can go in here and open this drop down, and we can manually choose how many samples we want to give to those particular areas. So if I were doing automatic or manual sampling, I would probably turn this up to about 1024 or 512, something that just gives more samples to reflection and refraction. And you might even want to increase the actual amount of brute force rays that you have in your scene. But truly, by default, I think you get a pretty great result with automatic sampling. And you could even keep this threshold maybe even around like 0.05 and get still a fairly good result. So you can see we're still getting some really nice reflections across the ground. Another thing worth noting here is in our detail section on our dome light, if we go in here, we can see we have a section at the bottom for caustics. So we can also control the intensity of the caustics that get cast down here. So I could go crazy and up this number to like 10, and you're going to see that really brightens that up. Or we could take this and just keep it at 1, and that's pretty standard. So I do also want to note that I think the Brute Force Caustics are slightly slower than Photon Caustics, but Brute Force Caustics is much nicer or much more friendly with dome lights and larger light sources instead of like an infinite light, like a spotlight or something. So in a lot of ways, I would opt for Brute Force Caustics if you're using dome lights to at least cast the main shadows with your glass. So anyways, I think this is already like a really nice result. The only other thing that I sometimes do in my scene is create a material for my ground. So we could pull that on our plane. And then I'll just make the color white again. And then I like to just take the roughness down and maybe even up some metalness or change our IOR value so that we get some nice reflections of our shapes on the ground. So you can see now we've got some slight reflections in areas like right here. And I think that just adds even more to our scene. So, oh, and then one more thing, Ellie, I might switch to the Maxon screen, the documentation at least. So I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to switch over there really quick. Oh, and you're muted, Ellie.
Oh, what a rookie mistake.
No.
I've put our faces up, so
okay,
feel free to
perfect.
documentation.
All right. So I'm now sharing the screen, and don't worry, we've all muted ourselves in video meetings.
Oh, we've honestly, you think I'd be, you know, better than that by now, but hey,
all good.
Away.
I do it all the time. Don't worry. But yeah, so I wanted to just point out that if you Google Maxon Caustics, I think it's even the first result. There's this really, really helpful documentation page that describes the different types of caustics and also like has some really nice comparisons. So like here's a great example, I think, of where Brute Force Caustics really works really well. It really thrives with larger area lights. So as the size increases, it still handles that really well. Here's another one. And then this is just showing where photons do better, like with the spotlight. And then here's another example with like the dome light, or actually maybe that's right here. So yeah, with photons, you're going to get a lot of this really big, like a lot of really spread out fuzziness of the actual photons being scattered. Whereas the Brute Force Caustic system handles the actual caustics with dome lights much better. So yeah, I really recommend just reading through the documentation here. The Maxon team put together a ton of great resources, and especially if you're trying to dive in and learn the differences between the two systems, I think this one's ideal. So covers a ton, really, really helpful. Just Google Maxon Caustics and it's probably like the first link.
Yeah, I'm honestly such an advocate for documentation. It's where I learn pretty much most of what I know other than from the Maxon training team. I've linked it in the chat as well.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to kind of just grab that, yeah, it's a great tool.
Perfect. All right, I'll dive back into my Cinema 4D scene.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, I think that kind of covers it for this particular scene. We can just pick a different frame if we want, but that's basically the effect. Yeah, just making sure that you have Brute Force Caustics enabled and choosing a dome light primarily as the source, you're going to get really nice results. And then you can also go in and change, sorry, let me click my dome light. You can just change the intensity here in the caustic section of that light. So I think if we feel good, I'm ready to move on to the next scene.
Yeah, perfect.
All right.
Yeah. Also, as a reminder, any questions for Jess or anything, then just let us know in the chat, and then we can ask those.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let me close my IPR. I'm going to pull up the next render. So I think this next one I'm going to do is this rolling disc scene. So we've got these like hills, and then we've got some cylinders rolling down them, and our glass material actually has some flakes in there. So they're just a little bit more interesting, but not too different from kind of the caustic example we were just working with. Still a really sunny scene here, but I think it would just be fun to show that process. So let's dive into how I did that one. So I'm also going to start off with a cube, and I'm going to scale this one down as well, make it thin, but I'm not going to make it very small. I'm just going to keep it kind of the size and maybe even increase the length a little bit here. And for working in here, I'm actually going to hide my work plane. I don't really need that visible. Okay, so we need to actually make this cube have a wavy surface. And the way we're actually going to do that is by going into the deformers here, and we're going to grab a formula deformer. And you want to make sure it is the one with the little FX in front of it. There's also formula in here, which has this kind of wave icon, and there is a formula field here. So you want to make sure you use the purple FX formula grab it from the right spot, it should show up with this cube. And yeah, this is just what's going to form our actual waviness. So if we go to our cube, we now need to increase our segments. Let me hit NB. And let me make sure that I drag my formula onto my cube as well. It won't affect it by default. You need to make sure it's a child of the cube. And you're going to see right away we're now getting some of that shape showing up. So the formula actually works kind of like a ripple. Like you can see the middle of the cube is now actually dented, whereas it's creating those ripple waves around the middle. So I don't actually want it to look like that. I want the waviness to start after the ripple, and I don't want to see that dent in the middle at all. So I'm actually going to click on our formula here, and I'm going to drag this off to the right. So I just want it to get to a spot where I only see those waves. So something like here works great for me. And then I'm going to maybe lower the height of these waves a little bit, which is this axis here. And then I can also extend or shorten this to add more waves to our scene. So maybe something around 300 works great. And I don't need this to apply to the bottom of my cube either. So I'm going to actually go into the formula field section, and I'm going to grab a linear field this time right here. And we can set this to positive Y axis. And I just want to shorten this maybe in my scene and get it to a spot I'm happy with. So something like there is just fine. And then I can hide my formula field. But if we were to hit play on this, this will actually animate the waves, which could create something really interesting. I think if you were maybe wanting a single object to be rolling on some hills continuously, this might be an interesting way to do that. But for my sake, I actually just want these to be solid, unmoving objects. So I'm going to kind of rotate our cube first because I want things to be rolling off of them. So I might tilt it about that much. And then I'm just going to hit E on my keyboard to grab the gizmos again. And I'm going to hold Control and just drag a few copies of this same cube next to the first one. So I'll do probably 2 more copies, something like right here. And let me hit NA on my keyboard. I'm getting a little distracted by the lines. And I just want these each to be unique. So we can just go in and click the formula field for each one. And I can just drag this to a different position to get a slightly different wave pattern. So that works for that one. Then I'll go in here, unhide the formula field, move this one. Hold on, am I affecting the wrong one? Oh, I'm moving the linear field. Make sure you're clicking on the formula field. Okay, so there's this one, and then one more time. Let's make sure we can see it, and dragging to a spot that we like. So maybe I'll do right there. I just want them all to be kind of slightly different. And then I'm just going to combine all of these. I'm going to put them in a null first. And you can make a copy if you're kind of wanting to go back to this, but for my sake, I know I'm just going to work with these. So I'm going to connect these objects and delete. And then I'm going to rename this to ramp, or ramps maybe would be a better term. And then we can just add a collider tag right on top of this. So go to simulation tags and then add your collider. And then essentially you can just move to the side and see, do we think this is enough rotation for things to fall off of them? I think we might get stuff stuck here, but maybe we can test that and rotate it more later as needed. But now I think we have the surface we want to work with. Let's move on to creating those clones. So like last time, I'm going to grab a cylinder and I'm going to just drag this out here so I can see it. And let's make this short, maybe about here. I'm going to also put this on Z axis, and I might scale this one a little bit down, somewhere about there. And this we can put into a cloner now. So let's grab a cloner. Let's put our cylinder in there. And then I don't think I need 3 for our count on this side. I actually just want to go upwards. So in our Y axis, I'm going to increase the count of clones. And let's drag this above our ramp. And we could even start changing the size because it's a little bit too spread out. So if I start scaling this down, I can change how far out those go. And I do want to add one more row to these because we have 4 ramps and I want the clones to each have their own kind of aisle to roll down. Okay, so let me also change the width, and I kind of want to align these so that they look like they're at the top of each of these ramps or sitting in the middle about, so something like that maybe. And I want to make sure that these are not too far off to an edge so that they'll just roll backwards. or I want to try to avoid that. And I just want to keep these lifted above the ramps themselves. So something about here, maybe we want to increase our rotation segments on our cylinder just a little bit. So maybe like leave it at 30. And I might even add a bevel onto this as well. So I'm going to drag a bevel, put that on my cylinder, and increase the subdivision maybe once or twice. And then we can go right into our cloner and we can add our rigid body tag. So now this will interact with our ramps. The only thing though is to start, I think we need to change this thickness value in the collision tab. This is going to control kind of the gapping, or like what I call is like a protective shell around your rigid body objects. So if it's set too high, you might get some gapping as objects kind of stack on top of each other. So I like to keep this actually pretty low. I'm going to set this to like 0.2. And then I might go in, we'll change some other settings in a minute, but I just want to preview what this looks like right now. So let me frame this a little bit and let's just see. It might take a second to kind of calculate. Let's see what we're working with. Okay, so by default, we're going to get something like this, and the clones are probably going to turn over and not keep an upright position. And I found that in the rigid body tag, if you go down here to this damping section, we have this checkbox where we can override it. And if you check that on and increase this angular value, maybe like 100 to 200, somewhere within there, you're going to start to see that they don't flip over as much. So if we now hit play, you can see we still have a couple of them flipping over, but for the most part, a lot of them are staying upright. So I can actually increase that even more if I would like, maybe 150. Let's take another peek. So it's doing pretty good. I might need to rotate my ramps again because I think some of those are getting stuck. So let me rotate it a little bit here and then maybe move it behind them a little bit more. And let's just take a look. I might also go and hit Control D on my keyboard to go to our simulation settings, and I'll go to the scene section. And I'm going to take my gravity actually down to only -500 because I want this to be a little bit slower. So let's take a look now. So I think that'll do for our sake. I won't spend too much time messing with that, but in your own scenes, feel free to keep playing around. I'm going to increase my frames to 150, and then I think I'm going to just try caching this. If it's taking a long time, then I won't, but let me just see. Should be pretty quick. Okay, cool. So now we'll have the ability to just run through here and play those frames back. So I might choose something like this spot right here to kind of frame my scene. So I'm going to grab a camera and I'm going to set the focal length to maybe 120 or 85. I really like using those values, and align my camera in a spot that I really like, maybe something right here. And then now we can start adding our actual lights and materials like last time. So I'm going to start with a dome light. Let me grab another sunny one. I also enjoyed this concrete blocks HDR that's in here. So I'm going to drag that into my layers, and then we can open up our render view. So I'm going to grab our render view and pull that over here. If we hit play, we can see what we're working with. So this is where we're at right now. I might actually also add our bevel object onto our ramps because I think I want to smooth out those edges a little. And then we can start building the glass shader. So let me create two materials here, one for our ramps, and I'll drag a copy and create one for our cylinders. Okay, so let me drag the ramp material onto our ramps and the cylinders onto our cloner. And I'm going to set the color of the ramp. Let's make sure we're in base properties. I'm going to set that to kind of a cream tone, something about here. And then I'm going to go into our cylinders and we'll start building the material like I had in my render. So I know that I also want to use the color user data node to uniquely assign colors to each of my clones. So let me just resize my window here a little. So I'm going to double click and add our color user data and make sure we set our preset to objects, geometry, ID, color. And again, if we solo that, we'll be able to see unique shades applied to each of our clones. And then I'm going to grab a ramp and I'm going to plug that into our ramp there. And maybe for this one, we'll choose something more like this black, violet, orange color. And I might just delete the very end shade because I kind of just want to work with these 4 colors. And then likewise, I'm also going to put a color correct node in here just to kind of brighten this or change the hue if I want. And I will drag this out color into transmission color like we did before. So now if we take our transmission all the way up, because again, for this new material, the transmission weight's at 0. If we take that up, let's unsolo this node as well. We're going to see those random colors are now being applied as we'd like. But another thing worth noting, though, is that sometimes not all the shades in your ramp are probably going to be applied to each of the clones. And I found that if I select all of the notches in my ramp and then scale these kind of in closer together and bring it towards the center, sometimes that helps increase. I think just bringing it together will assign more of the shades randomly throughout. Whereas before it's kind of creating more of a blend between the tones. This way you're getting more of a direct variation. So, and then I do like those, but I might just increase the gamma a little bit in our color correct. So I think we've got the color set up. The other thing I'm going to do though that we haven't shown before is introduce the Flakes node. And this one is so much fun. I really love using the Flakes. Highly recommend trying it if you've never explored. Let me zoom into some of these clones so we can kind of solo this node and take a look. So the Flakes are really great if you want to create like some glitter or polka dots or something. We've got options, so many options here actually for settings. We've got Voronoi and dots. I really like using both, but I like that we have the ability to control the density and the scale. So this is what I use to create the flakes in my glass material. I just played around with the density and changed this to dots. And then you may notice that we have several output options from the node. And if we use just out alpha, you're just going to get a straight black or white result of these dots. And if we use out flakes ID, it will be a grayscale version of that, but it won't be just straight up black and white. It'll have a variety of tones. So this can actually be used as a mask. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go and grab a material blender and plug our glass material that we made into the base color. And then I'm going to grab this Outflakes ID and plug that into the blend color for layer 1. And we now need a material that we want for those flakes. So I'm just going to drag a copy holding control of our Redshift standard material. And I'm going to remove the transmission weight because we don't need that. And I'm actually going to make this kind of a gold metallic color. So let's see here. Let's take our metalness up and then we can plug that into our material color and make sure we now change what is being chosen for the surface in our output. So we can just plug this out into the surface and we have our flakes soloed. So let's unsolo that. And now we should see that if you get this pink showing up, it might be because you just need to refresh. Sometimes I've had that happen with the IPR and refreshing it usually takes that issue away. So now you can see we have some beautiful color variation and some really fun reflective flakes in our material. So you can get some really interesting stuff with that. Let's see, before I dive into the caustics and just enabling brute force, I might also go into our ramp material. And let me extend the window a little. And for this one, I think in my render, I just added something really simple. I brought in a bump map node, plugged that in here. And then I grabbed a Maxon noise. So I use Maxon noises all the time. There's so many great things to do with a Maxon noise. So I recommend trying it if you haven't. If you solo this, you can see what it's doing to the ramps. It's just projecting this noise. And we've got all these great noise types to choose from. I really love using FBM. And this octaves value kind of controls sometimes how much detail is in the noise. So if we take this down, you can see it's pretty blurry. If we take it up, it has a ton of detail, and you'll notice more of that fine detail if you really zoom into the noise. But I'm going to also go to the input tab, and I'm going to change the overall scale from 100 to maybe 50, just to get to see what that's like. And we can unsolo this, and we will now see we have this texture applied to our ramp. So right there, you're really seeing it. So I think that's good for our floor. Let's now turn on our caustics, and then I'm going to change the direction, I think, of the light, just so we can really see those shadows even more. So I'm going to go up to our render settings, make sure we're in advanced and in Redshift, go to the caustic section, and once again, turn on brute force for our caustics. So you'll see those shadows get richer and those colors are kind of a deeper tone. And so that's just, it looks really, really nice. Okay, let's change our dome light angle so we can see the shadows further. So I'm going to go to coordinates, and this is where I just like to kind of play around and get a feel for where I want those shadows facing. So I think in my render, I had it something around here, and let's see. You can just get crazy, really play around with that angle, really increase it. I might change the intensity also of this dome light, and I'm going to go down to details, and I'm going to increase the intensity maybe to 3. Oh, and also I do recommend having denoising on just to be extra safe so you don't have some grainy caustics. Ultimately, I think having a really low threshold value will get you the best results, but obviously that will eat away at some of your time. It will increase just how long it takes to render a single frame. So I try to keep this 0.05 is a good number. And with the default caustic settings, you can still get away with a really nice result with something like 0.05, sometimes even 0.1, but that's kind of pushing it. Yeah, okay, so that's that. Let me think here. I think that's kind of the effect for this one. Let's just find another frame. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's it for this one. How are we doing on time, Ellie? I'm happy to move on to the next scene.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, no, we're good. With yeah, we are 1:45, so kind of 15 minutes. But you know, if we overrun, it's not a problem. We did actually have a quick question.
Oh yeah.
John, which I was kind of in the middle of typing, but I mean, it's a good time to ask it live. So he was wondering, does tessellation affect the dynamics? For example, on the ramps, because they're relatively low poly, would tessellation smooth it out visually?
Yes.
And would it affect the dynamics?
Yeah, no, I think it should. I mean, it will smooth it out in the render, but I don't know. I don't think it's actually like smoothing the polygons in the actual simulation. So if you had something really, really low poly, even lower than what my ramps are right now, I think you might have some blockier movement in the sim, but the render itself would be pretty smoothed out. So let me just add the render tag or object tag to our ramps and override the geometry and enable that tessellation. I'm going to uncheck screen space adaptive. So you can see we have smoothed out that jaggedness. But again, I'm pretty sure that the simulation itself will just follow whatever value of polygons or however dense your mesh is in the actual scene. It's not going to change that, I believe. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, I will move on to the next scene. Perfect. So let me open a new scene here. Okay, and then I'll show the render, and then I've got a kind of comparison for caustics later, but here is the final scene. So you've probably seen this one before. This one was really fun, just modeling some funky glasses and then spinning these around, and I think the reflection on the ground just looks really fun too. So let's dive into how I did that. So for this one, I'm actually going to drag in the figure object just for kind of a reference for scale. Because I believe this is like an accurate person size. And then in the right of the view part, there's this toggle view button or toggle active view. And then we can kind of go to all these different viewports. So I want to go to this front view. So I can just click that icon again to go inside there. And I'm going to zoom in. So we're kind of by his knees or feet. And I just want to kind of use this as a reference for scale when I'm modeling this glass. So instead of using like shapes and kind of using Boolean or something to kind of take the inside of the glass out, I'm actually going to create this with a spline. So I'm going to go into the splines area here and choose empty spline. And then we can grab the spline pen tool and just start kind of creating the outline of half of our glass. And then we'll use Lathe to complete the full shape. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to scroll in a little bit maybe, and I'm going to create a point directly at the center. And I'm going to drag this out completely horizontally and drag a little 90 degrees upwards. And this is going to create the little lip on the bottom of our glass. And then I'm going to drag outwards again, 90 degrees or about. And I'm going to drag upwards 90 degrees. And once again, make another little few 90-degree angles. So something like this for our shape. And this is a very strange shape for a glass, but it was just fun for the caustics. So feel free to make whatever glass shape you want. But then I'm going to highlight all of my points like this. And if I right click, we have this option to create an outline. And this is really helpful to just kind of emphasize the thickness of your glass right away before putting it into a lathe. So I created that, or I clicked that create outline button, and we have this new icon with our cursor. So now if I click and drag, you can see I can either create an outline outwards or inwards from the original point that I made. So I'm going to go inwards, something like right here. And we have a point that's a little bit off, so I'm going to just drag that upwards. And this is kind of half of the outline of our glass. So now I can grab a lathe node, or a lathe modifier, which is here by subdivision. And if I grab that, we can drag our spline right in there, and you can see our mesh now looks like a full cup. So if I go back to our original viewport, we can zoom in here. Obviously, this is not accurate to how a normal drinking glass would be sized. It's more like a giant planter. But let's just say that that's okay for us for now. I do also want to point out that sometimes you might see, I've had it before where like when I use spline to create a cup, at the very bottom, if you see like this like black shape in the middle, it might be that your points at the center are not actually centered, and you can just highlight those points in the spline and move them to the correct position, and that should fix that. But I'm now going to put this lathe into a volume builder and volume mesher. So grab those two objects, and we're going to put the builder into the mesher and drag our lathe into the volume builder. So when we do that, our shape changes, and this is not what we're going for, and that's just because the voxel size is too large. So I'm going to try setting this to 1, and if that's a little bit too high still, I can try maybe 0.5, and that should bring a little bit more of our edges back in there. And then I'm going to grab this SDF smooth layer and drag the strength down, because I just kind of want to smooth out some of those harsh edges. So something about here is what I'm happy with, because I can still see that lip of the glass down here, but also get a little bit of less jaggedness in the polygons. So I'm happy with that, but I also want to put this into a remesh, which is going to give us the ability to kind of, for one, lower the mesh density. So if I hit NB on my keyboard, you can see it's really dense right now, but I can set the mesh density over here. So I could say maybe 10%, and that will take that number down drastically. And you can see that right now we have what looks like more polygons at the top and at these edges than the rest of the mesh. And that's because of this adaptiveness. So if we take this all the way down to 0, it should even those spacing out between all the polygons and give you something much more even like this. So I might even up our mesh density to 15. See if that creates a little bit of a nicer edge there. So a little bit more flat edge on the top. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to just right click on our remesh and do connect objects and delete. And I'm going to call this class. And the other thing I want to just quickly cover is this pattern selection tool that Cinema has, which is super handy. So you can use any selection and create a pattern out of it. I've been doing this with like loop selections. So what I do, oh gosh, I might have just, we'll make a random selection here, and I'll just show you what I'm talking about, because I didn't have the loop selections looking like that before. Okay, I'll just select something like this area here. So just on the outside of our glass, but not going all the way down to the bottom of the cup. And then what I can do is I can go, actually, let me select these top 2 polygons as well. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the select menu, and then I'm going to do pattern selection. And what should happen is you should now see we have these 4 arrows that show up on the viewport. And this will just indicate where it's going to project a pattern of that same selection you made. So I'm just going to choose one direction here. And then I'm going to go to the right. We should have these options for mirror, repeat count, and margin. And the repeat count, pretty obvious. It's just going to control how many times it projects that same selection across the mesh. And the margin is the space between all of those. So I try to just even this out. So it might take some finagling. Maybe we'll just say something like this looks fairly even to me. So then if you're happy with that selection, you can hit apply. It will make that selection. And then we can go up to select and store it, so that now we can always go back and click on this if we need. But before deselecting that, I'm actually going to go to the Extrude Deformer, and I'm going to click and drag over where we had those same selections. So this is going to add some really interesting ridges to our glass, and we'll just make it a little bit more fun for the actual reflected caustics on the ground. Okay, One other thing I'm going to do to this glass, let me go back to object view and hit NA on my keyboard. I'm actually going to also add a vertex map. So we can go into other tags and go to vertex map. And if we click on it and select use transfer, we'll get this kind of fields looking area. I'm going to just delete the freeze. But if you haven't done this before, it's really handy. You can actually drag in polygon selections into your vertex map, and it will create a vertex map of that selection. So we can actually use this in our materials later if we wanted a different color or material just in those areas. Okay, so let me delete our figure guy. We no longer need him in there. And I'm actually going to grab a ground plane. So we've got some kind of surface. I'm going to increase that. And I'm going to grab a cloner and put our glass inside of that. And I'll keep the default amounts, but I'm just going to drag the clones closer together. Something about here. And in my scene, I had these rotating. So you could do this a couple different ways. In my actual render, I actually made the cloner editable, and then I applied the vibrate tag. And I actually used the vibrate tag a little bit in the last stream. So feel free to look at that or search for tutorials. There's probably a ton of it out on YouTube. But for this case, I'm actually just going to grab the random effector or random field. And I'm going to go to the parameter and turn off position, and I just want to enable the rotation. So I know that I want these cups to be able to rotate 365 degrees in the H, so I'm going to put 360 here. And then maybe you just want to tip these a little bit on the P and B values, so I'm just going to set like 20 and 20 for both of these. And maybe that's too much. Maybe we want to do 15 and 15. And then I'm going to go back to the Effector tab. And it's set to random mode by default, but I'm going to change this to noise. And I'm going to change the scale down pretty much to 1%, just so that, like if I'm picturing a noise being projected across these glasses, I want it to be so small that each clone is kind of affected uniquely instead of just a global kind of noise that has more of a soft transition, because I want these all to be rotating on their own kind of. It's hard to explain. But anyway, if we hit play, this will probably rotate pretty fast. So a little bit too intense for my liking, to be honest. The animation speed is just way too high. So I'm going to take this down to 20, and let's see what we're working with now. So this is much nicer. I can definitely deal with this speed. And if you have like some intersections on the ground from tipping your cups, you can always just click your cloner and drag this a little bit upward. And you're seeing they're changing because the noise from the random effector is just affecting them differently in 3D space. So it's going to change that rotation if you move the cloner. But okay, I think we're ready to move on to some materials now. So let me add a camera so we can frame this. I'm going to set this to 85 for our focal length. And maybe I'll scrub through to a frame that I want. Maybe the very end is fine. And I'm going to set it over here so that we can get shadows cast off to the right. So even though it's not centered, I'm okay with that. Let's grab a dome light. I'm going to do the same concrete one I used before, just because I think that one, the sunny stuff, is always going to work really well. But honestly, any dome light with hot shadows or hot lighting will really work well. So like the sun is always going to be really intense, or something with really bright studio lighting. Yeah, you just want to be able to cast really intense shadows. So let's grab our render view, and I'm going to dock that to the right, hit play. And this is what we're going to see. So I know that I need to rotate my dome light so that I have those shadows on the right-hand side. So let me actually rotate this value first, something like that. And maybe about there is good enough for me. And now we can start creating our materials. So like before, let's create a material for our cloner. I'll call this glasses, and I'll drag this onto our cloner. And then I'll create one more and just call this tiles, because in my render, I had the flooring kind of look like some tiles, and it's actually really easy to do. So let's dive into that material first. And we are going to use a node that you're probably going to be blown away by. It's called tiles. Probably weren't expecting that, but it's pretty straightforward. We have a tile node that we can just work with right away and create a flooring pattern that's super easy and effective. So I'm actually going to change all these colors here to be black or white, and that way we'll just have kind of the grout in between the tiles or the fake tiles that we're making. And I'm soloing it so I can just see what I'm working with when I change these settings. So I'm going to change this grout width value just by dragging that so it's smaller, and also this bevel width. So I want it to be fairly small like that. And then I can just plug that node into a ramp. And this one will be controlling our color of the tiles. So I'm really only going to set that to be like 2 shades. I'm not going to do anything crazy this time. The white value will represent the color of the tiles. So I might just, maybe I'll just choose like a light blue, and then maybe this black value, I'll do maybe more of a muted dark purple, maybe something like that. And I can plug that into our color. And then for the original tile node, we can actually just plug that into the bump map since it's already set up to be black and white. And this should give us some deformations on our flooring. So you can see we've got the color there, and we could always just increase, our bump height. Play with this as you'd like. You could plug it into displacement as well. But let's move on to the glass material itself. I'm going to come in here and grab, we're kind of rinsing and repeating this process of grabbing different colors for the clones. You could use the color user data. I actually might just use a ramp just for the sake of this particular animation. But if we solo a ramp and this material is applied to our glasses, you can see, like you would expect, we've got the black shade starting at the bottom of the cups, and then it's white at the top. And you can even use this as a mask if you want to like blend between different colors in the color layer node, or in like a material blender, or even control like the transmission weight with this value because it can work as a mask. Or you can just get some really interesting transitions in colors by using the ramp. So you could choose this kind of preset, get something kind of sunset colored. I think we already used that one though, so maybe we'll want to try like orange and blue. It's worth just experimenting here. Choose whatever colors you would like. Maybe I'll try this one. And let's see, reversing it. Okay, so that might be fun. I'm going to try reversing those, and maybe I'll drag this a little bit to the right. So we've got more of that transition right in the middle. And then like before, I'm going to pull this into a color correct node. You guys know the drill. I'm going to increase the gamma and plug this then into our transmission color. And if we unsolo this now, and if we make sure we turn our transmission on, then we should see that color coming into play. So I think this is not bright enough yet, or it could just be that our floor is pretty intensely saturated. So maybe I'll choose a different color. Let's see here. Maybe I do want that sunsetty tone. I might do something like this. And then, yeah, so I think that's just fun. And we mentioned before that we made the Vertex Map so that we could blend materials. So I'm going to bring in the material blender node again. And I'm going to plug our Redshift standard material in there, plug that into the out for our surface. And then we can just grab what is called the vertex attribute. And this node has a spot where you can drag any kind of vertex map. So we already have one created, which is convenient. So we can just drag this little vertex map icon from our layers into here. And then this can actually be used as a blend between materials. So we can just plug this right into the blend color on our material blender. And then what we want to do is drag a copy of our material like last time. I'm going to make this metallic and maybe like a red tone. I'm going to turn off transmission, and then this will get plugged into that material color. So right away you can see now anywhere where we extruded those polygon selections, we have a metallic color. So the nice thing about this is it also will affect our shadows. And I think the more ridges you put in a glass that you're modeling, or like if you added flakes to your material or something, that will then show up in the reflection with our caustics and whatnot. So you can just really create some interesting like shadows and yeah, just caustic reflections by adding a little bit of more interesting surface deformations to your objects or changing up the materials this way. So I think that's super fun. I'm actually not loving this tile color right now. I think it's too intense. So let me change this color a little bit a second. Maybe just lightening that will help. Okay, so I like that a little bit more And let me change maybe the angle of our dome lights before we turn on our caustics. So maybe I want that there. Maybe I just need to make this a little bit more intense. I want to just brighten it up. And you could even go into the color and kind of add a little bit of a color influence to the dome light as well. Sometimes that helps. So I think that's super fun. Let's also go in and turn on our caustics. So again, go to Advanced and Redshift. Make sure we have our Brute Force Caustics enabled. And you can see right away, we're going to get those much richer shadows and the caustics reflecting on the ground. So another thing that I do want to point out is I saw a tip somewhere that one way you can increase how light is passing through your glass objects is actually to increase the combined trace depth. So if I increase this number, we might see that. It might also just be hard to see without this is processing because the caustics do take some time to kind of render here. But increasing those trace depths tends to give you better results. So I actually have a comparison of what this kind of looks like. So here's an image. Feel free to pause if you want to kind of see the text and just spend time on that. These don't have a ton of huge differences. I tried out just some manual versus auto sampling, and you can see I have a couple different threshold values as well as using default caustics or trace depths versus like the timing you get by changing some of those. So even with just manual sampling, I got like my render time for this down to like 55 seconds. So it's really just kind of worth exploring. But as you can see with default trace depths, you're getting darker shadows here than you get with something right here. So light passes through more easily with increased trace depths on your glass objects. So yeah, I might go in here. I'm going to increase our intensity of our caustics, maybe to 3. And then the only final thing I might point out is that one thing you could do is you can make 2 dome lights in your scene, one for lighting your scene and one for actually controlling the caustics. So I believe we have to take our dome light, and if we wanted this to just represent caustics, I think we actually want to turn off all of these except for the first 2, or actually it might be the reverse. So this one actually might be the scene, the diffuse, and then the second one I'll just call caustics, and this one we want the opposite. And we want to make sure that that bottom setting is set to render settings. So if we turn off 1, we're going to see this is just our caustics. So this is our easy way to see like how your caustics are going to be reflected on the ground by disabling diffuse and reflection and then increasing that intensity. And then the other one is just going to be the reversed sliders, which will just light your scene. So we could set this to kind of any brightness. You could set this low and still have the caustics really intense if you wanted. But yeah, you could always just keep it at the default, have all the sliders on, have caustics enabled. I just find that sometimes gives some more control in your scene. So yeah, that's kind of how I did this scene as well. I don't know if there's anything else here to kind of go over as far as the setting up the animation, but is there any questions or anything there?
Let me have a little look.
Okay.
Yeah, also thanks for sharing your like the render settings
Yeah.
and the comparisons. That's really cool to see. Yeah, because not everyone kind of shares exactly how they got that really nice final look.
Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see because I'm a real advocate for manual sampling.
Totally.
I know it takes some tweaking and it takes some time, but yeah, it's good to see kind of those actual examples that you had.
Totally. Well, and that's where like I'll pull that image back up. Yeah, because that's where I'm just like the time, I got that time down so far, and yet we still have such a nice result. So I think if you especially spend some time in that Redshift caustic documentation page, I think you'll just kind of get a feel for what kind of samplings you want to use or what kind of values you want to use and just how much it'll affect the scene and what types of lights to use. But yeah, manual sampling can be really, really nice for sure.
Yeah, especially like you said, for optimizing render times, that's really where Redshift can shine is, yeah, as you begin to kind of understand what sampling is doing and the type of sampling rays, then you can be like, okay, I don't need any of this, but I need loads of this. And so we can optimize that way.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's totally just dependent on the lighting because like even just the type of dome light you use. Because like I think that image, you see some really nice caustics and usually you get some really nice reflections with sunny stuff. But if you just throw in kind of a washed out dome light or an overcast scene, you're really not going to get that same kind of look. So yeah, it's just totally dependent on the way you're lighting it and those specific samples. And yeah. So that's that one. I'm gonna now switch out of the scene view unless we have like
we have a couple of quick questions actually. So Christian, so this was actually back on the previous one. So the discs and the ramp that you were creating. He was wondering, is it possible to control the animation on the formula Deformer? So I imagine as you were creating that ramp, could you have kept that procedural and maybe added some keyframes to that?
Yeah, I actually am not totally sure on keeping that animating or kind of controlling that. I know you can, there's like a section in the formula field. Let me pull that up actually. I'll just pull it into the scene even though we're not going to use it.
Yeah.
It might not be in this, or I think it's this a little equation here actually. So I think you can kind of control the timing with stuff here. I haven't used it enough to really have spent a ton of time messing with that. I just like realized that could be used to create the waves, but it could also be like, I know this is like the time value here at the end. So like if you play with these numbers that are in the actual equation here, I think you can control what
the formula is doing.
Yeah. And like this can be keyframed. So I'm sure you can kind of change that value around. I just haven't personally played with it enough to tell you exactly how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the formulas, but what you can do is similar to how you looked at the Redshift documentation. You can right click and show help, and it actually shows you all the different formulas that you could use for the style effect that you're after. Because there are loads of them, and unless you are crazy into maths, which I'm not, I can't remember all those.
I think the documentation is so helpful. Like I really went into that with the caustic stuff, but I think there's probably documentation even on the formula stuff and so many other fields that would just be mind blowing to read. So I have a lot of personal homework I'm going to be doing in the Maxon documentation.
Absolutely. One quick question as well from Just Hit Play.
Yeah.
Are you doing 3D exploration daily? And if so, how many hours a week do you, I think I like this quote, play around? It really seems like you know your techniques very well.
Oh, thank you. So firstly, let me just say I'm a night owl. I knew when I was learning that I was going to be doing this after work, so I'd be staying up late if I really wanted to learn it. So oftentimes I'll spend several hours a night just playing around. I try to create every day, but lately it's just been like every other or something. So yeah, I try to do it really often just to make sure that I'm constantly learning. But I always tell myself that I'm not going to force myself to create if it isn't fun. And I think that's really key because it's otherwise really easy to get really burnt out. So I would recommend doing it often, but specifically trying to do things that are exciting to you. So personally, I browse Pinterest all the time. Pinterest has so many things that I'm like, ooh, that'd be fun to try recreating that. And I think if you can learn to recreate stuff too, that's another really good just skill. And you learn a lot in that process of like I used to spend some time just modeling mugs for fun, and like coffee mugs, there's so much variety, and you sometimes can see those really fine details in like the ceramic and trying to recreate those materials. So that's just one example, but look at Pinterest or look at some other kind of mood board site. Daily creating is what I aim for, if that answers that. So
no, that's great. Great question and great answer as well. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear how people learn. Like I'm similar to you. I enjoy trying to recreate things, especially to learn a new technique, because like you said, that can be sometimes the best way to learn. And then we have a nice outcome that we're then happy with. So we get that like learning satisfaction as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so rewarding. It's such a fun thing.
Yeah.
I love recreating things.
Yeah. And it's great seeing your workflow. I was just kind of to kind of like wrap up as well. I know we're a little bit over, but hey, it's the Maxon training team live stream, so of course we are. It's great to see like the entire process, because I know sometimes it's hard, especially during like a short live stream, to see everything from start to finish. But I think that's why these are such special live streams with you showing your workflow, because you are quite literally having the blank viewport And at the end of it, it's this great, beautiful looking render with the motion and the texturing. So yeah, as someone who's enjoying watching these, just like everyone else is, yeah, it's amazing to see your process. So
wow, thank you so much. It's such an honor. I just get so excited to share it with everybody too. It's so fun. I learned from so many people like you, Ellie, so it's only my duty to just share what I know.
No, well, that's why you're here and that's why you're on. It's so great, and you can tell that you enjoy teaching and explaining this.
Thanks.
Yeah, so hopefully you can go back through the comments that I've had the pleasure of reading as you've been working hard. I've just been kind of chilling and enjoying it.
I'm gonna get another monitor one of these days and I'll be able to see the comments then. But for now, I appreciate your hard work and looking through those comments. I'm going to switch over too now so I can see you, because right now.
Yes, so I've put our faces on. So yeah, you're free to put whatever on your screen that you like.
Beautiful. Now I can see you.
We're cool. Here. So yeah, hopefully you can see some of the nice comments coming in as well. Yes. From everyone. And just a final reminder to everyone or anyone that's on live or actually watching this recording is you can access these project files. And so they're actually in the link in the description. So I've linked it in the chat earlier, but those of you who don't have access to the chat, then you can find them in there. So feel free to play around. And yeah, next week, final week.
The final one.
We'll be looking at some fuzzy, hairy, spongy textures, right?
Very excited. I love those. They're always a fun time. Texture stuff's the best.
Oh, honestly, I'm with you. Hey, I could spend hours just in the node editor, just
me too.
Textures.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, brilliant. Well, yes, I suppose we can wrap this up. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jess, again, for this great week, going through these great projects, sharing your project files. And thank you to everyone who's been in the chat, who's with us, asked questions, shared their thoughts and their feedback. We really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, y'all are the best. I really appreciate everybody submitting questions and also just providing a space for us to go through this stuff. I think so valuable.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, enjoy the rest of your day or evenings, depending on, where you are in the world. And we will catch you next Wednesday.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.